Welcome to the very first edition of PeaceLines Podcast, brought to you by the London Region Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. CND says no to nukes, no to wars, and yes to a peaceful, secure, nuclear weapons-free future. PeaceLines aims to tell it as it is. From the eye-watering amounts of money that politicians are spending on weapons of war, to what's happening here in Britain, and what's afloat in far-off places. In each episode, we'll be talking to specialists, academics, researchers, campaigners, and even the occasional politician. And they'll all be telling you in plain language what's going on in their neck of the woods. I'm Carol Turner, London CND's presenter for today's episode, and I'll be speaking to Peter Burt, an AI specialist, about the Artificial Intelligence Action Summit, which was held in France recently. Peter's a biological scientist by background, and he's a freelance consultant, but I'm going to hand over to him to tell us more about himself. Peter.
Hi there, Carol. Thanks very much. So I'm Peter Burt, and I work for Drone Wars UK, who are a small organisation who research into the new emerging military technologies. So that includes drones, obviously, and also artificial intelligence and autonomous systems. And recently we've been working on space technology issues as well. And before working for Drone Wars, I used to work for Nuclear Information Service, another organisation that does research into military issues.
Thanks. Okay, question one. There's been a lot in the news about artificial intelligence, though some of its effects are real benefits for society. I'm thinking about the health implications, the fact that it can monitor processes that lead to climate change, etc. But there are also a number of worrying aspects of AI. So my first question to you, Peter, in a nutshell, what would you say the main advantages and difficulties with artificial intelligence are?
I think it's important to remember that there's nothing magic about artificial intelligence. The term is really a bit of a marketing term, a hype term. Really, artificial intelligence is nothing other than modern, sophisticated computing methods combined with very powerful computing systems that are now available. And this allows lots of data to be processed, vast quantities of data. This system can sift through and identify patterns, and it can use that to perform all kinds of tasks, mainly tedious tasks, which it can do very, very quickly, and also jobs which can kind of help in putting forward scientific breakthroughs. So, for example, there has been a lot of work on product development and in terms of looking at novel proteins, which may have all kinds of interesting applications. So certainly artificial intelligence has positive implications, but as you said, there are also some risks and worries about it. One of the risks is that it's a very brittle technology. So what that means is once it's been trained using a certain amount of data, if it then finds a new situation which it hasn't met in that data, then it has no context and no ability to sort of work out what to do. So the results will be very unpredictable. Another problem is data bias. The data sets which are used to train the artificial intelligence systems, they will never be 100% perfect, complete matches to the real world. So there'll always be biases in there, which can have unfortunate results as well. There are also issues about the way in which artificial intelligence systems are trained and copyright issues relating to data. And there are also issues about low wages and employment conditions for people who do the data processing and data input. But I think the biggest concern about artificial intelligence is the context in which it's being developed and used. It's kind of being built in the current capitalist world by technology companies and promoted by governments. They're not doing it for our interests. The companies are doing it to make money. The governments are doing it to cut costs and also consolidate their power. So these have important implications for the way in which AI systems are used and the way in which they affect citizens like us. It's not being done for our benefit.
Thanks. Okay, that leads me nicely into my second question. The Artificial Intelligence Action Summit was presented as bringing together heads of state and government with international organisations, commercial companies, academia and so on, in order to take steps towards creating a global framework for governance and thereby winning support, public trust for AI. What's your take on that?
I think the key phrase in your question, Carol, was winning public trust, because despite all of the AI marketing and hype, there is still a lot of skepticism and concern among the public about artificial intelligence. And as well as that, governments and corporations are aware of the shortcomings of artificial intelligence. They acknowledge those risks and obviously they want to address them. So originally, when the AI Summit started a couple of years ago, it was presented as an AI Safety Summit. And you might remember that the summit was hosted by the United Kingdom at Bletchley Park. And then there was a follow-up AI Safety Summit in Seoul in Korea the next year. This year's summit in Paris is billed as an AI Action Summit. So already we're seeing that the emphasis is drifting away from safety and is now looking at implementation. There were concerns about the way in which the original AI safety summits were framed. For example, they were only geared to looking at the risks from general artificial intelligence, the most powerful types of artificial intelligence, which don't yet really exist. One of the major shortfalls was the fact that the use of military artificial intelligence systems was explicitly ruled out of the discussions. So if you stop and think about it, the most dangerous conceivable uses of AI are not even being discussed at these summits. So we can see that there's only ever been a fairly thin remit in terms of looking at safety. That's now been compounded towards a drift looking at how AI can be used. And I think there's discussion of ethics, but it's more in the frame of lip service rather than actual anything meaningful.
Okay, what came out of the summit then?
So summits like this are usually geared towards putting together a grand declaration at the end. And there was a declaration from the AI Summit. But as well as that, there were some other interesting outputs as well. One of them was the publication of an international AI safety report, looking, as we said, about the risks from general artificial intelligence in particular. So that's something which is interesting. A fund was also set up for public interest artificial intelligence development. Again, it would be interesting to see how that plays out in future. And a coalition was set up to address some of the environmental impacts of artificial intelligence. Now that is a formidable challenge because, as I mentioned earlier, one of the reasons that artificial intelligence works is because it's based around very powerful modern computers. And those computers consume a large amount of energy when they're processing data. So this is actually one of the reasons why the government in this country is so keen to push towards new nuclear power. It sees that as an easy option to generate the increased demand that will come from AI data centers, which the government, again, is keen to set up in future. But again, as I say, that is a very, very challenging area, and whether that group has any success remains to be seen. There was also a declaration, as I mentioned, at the summit on the inclusive and sustainable uses of AI for people and the planet. Now, there's nothing there, of course, that anyone would disagree with, but how it actually plays out in practice, I think, depends a lot on the context in which it is interpreted. And again, remember what we said earlier, it will be interpreted in the context of capital, not citizens' protections.
Okay, now, I understand that Britain and the United States didn't sign up to that declaration you're talking about. Why was that? What was behind that?
Well, that's a very interesting point you've raised, Carol. What we saw at the summit was that the American Vice President, J.D. Vance, used the opportunity to criticise regulation of the tech sector by Europe. The European Union has introduced some quite progressive legislation on data protection, data use, and also the use of artificial intelligence, which obviously impacts very much upon the way in which American tech companies work. So Vance was criticising that. He also took the opportunity to have some oblique swipes at China as well and attack China and its work on AI. So the US refused to sign the declaration because of these concerns, and the UK, as the US's loyal supporter, followed suit. Now, all the press reports that I've read about the summit have said that, by and large, the summit was a success for everybody except the British because of the kind of humiliation of having to sort of support the Americans and throw away everything that it had wanted from the summit. In the days beforehand, the technology minister, Peter Kyle, science and technology minister who attended the summit, had been giving quotes to the media and briefing the media about how the government was very keen to introduce responsible, safe AI. But that has now gone out of the window. All of the things that the government said it wants to support, it's actually refused to sign up to in the declaration. So we kind of have the ironic situation where the two nations who are making the biggest fuss about safe and responsible artificial intelligence have actually refused to sign the declaration. And on paper, at least, China, one of the countries who they are presenting as an AI bogeyman, has signed the declaration and is willing to support up to these principles. So you can see why citizens in the UK might be surprised and concerned about this, because effectively it means the UK is leading the race to the bottom in terms of AI safety.
That sounds pretty damning. So let's turn now to the military uses, which you're particularly expert on. I mean, recently we've begun to hear about AI's role in warfare, such as surveillance systems and drones, unmanned drones. It's a topic with a very concerning aspect to it, it seems to me. And I'm taking from newspapers, reports, social media, there's growing concern about this, not just in the anti-war war community, but elsewhere. So, for my final question, Peter, can you give us a brief outline of how AI can be used in warfare? And perhaps you could say a few things about how it's currently being used in the Middle East and Ukraine, for example.
Sure. One of the reasons that the military wants to use artificial intelligence is that it allows things to be done much quicker than if humans are at the wheel. So, for example, data can be sort of processed and interpreted much quicker by a computer than by an intelligence analyst sitting through it and churning through it. So what we're finding is that images, video, all kinds of data can be processed using artificial intelligence computing methods and used for various military purposes. Now, the ones, of course, which are of most concern are of targeting and destroying those targets by use of military force. And this leads to problems because the speed at which the data is processed means that it's not always possible to have a human in control of the system. The computer is effectively making all the decisions and going off and sort of doing things on its own. So what we've seen in the invasion of Gaza by Israel, for example, a lot of good investigative work has been done by Israeli news media like 972 magazine and has exposed some of the artificial intelligence systems that the Israeli Defense Forces have been using. You've probably heard of systems like Lavender and Gospel. So these systems, they look at all kinds of data. We're told that they analyze data from phone conversations and WhatsApp networks, all kinds of things like that. And they use that to identify people who might be terrorists. What we've seen, however, is that the quantity of target information generated is so large that it's not in any way processed by humans. It's just passed on to the military and used to destroy those targets. So the result, as we've seen, has been, shockingly high numbers of civilian casualties. And this is quite an unacceptable way of waging any kind of warfare. What we've seen in Ukraine is something slightly different. We've seen a focus on autonomous military systems. So rather than just focusing on the hardware, on the software, the process is actually built into the military hardware as well. So we've seen drones, for example, which are increasingly able to do things on their own without human control. There's increasingly been a sort of move towards military systems that can target and destroy those targets on their own without meaningful human oversight. And this is a concern because if we stop and think about it, what it means is that we're developing effectively killer robots. These are systems, machines, which can take a human life without any human involvement in the process, any human command to do that, any human oversight of the process. That should be scaring you. It certainly scares me. So what we basically need to sort of stop this drift away from human control and towards the automation of warfare is a new internationally binding treaty which will control military autonomous weapon systems. And this is something which is currently being considered to a certain extent at the international level. We could see a treaty, for example, which would ban some of the most egregious uses of artificial intelligence in weapon systems. So, for example, weapon systems which targeted humans or discriminated against humans, systems which we can't understand how they work or why they work, maybe because their functioning is a mystery to us or because they work too fast. And with that, we have to have an obligation for some kind of meaningful human control of all weapon systems that are used by the military. So the commander has to be able to sort of say, this is under my control. I know what's going on. There's not so much data coming at me that I can't sort of keep afloat of what's happening. They have to do that, otherwise they might find themselves in the dock at a war crimes court. And as well as that, of course, any treaty should reaffirm and reinforce the existing principles of international humanitarian law, like protect civilians and protect vulnerable people during warfare. So that's what we need. I'm pleased to say that the international campaign to stop killer robots is actively and vigorously campaigning on that. And that's something which I would encourage all of your listeners, Carol, to have a look at and check out, learn more about that campaign and how to support it and how to pressure the UK government into supporting that treaty as well.
Thanks, Peter. My God, there's a lot of things to be scared about. That is a really worrying description of how it's used in warfare. I can remember, for instance, during the NATO invasion of Afghanistan, a surveillance system, an automated surveillance system, identifying a wedding party as a band of terrorists, and they were bombed and many of them were killed.
Unfortunately, there's been a number of incidents, where people have mistakenly been killed in drone strikes and aircraft attacks during the Afghan war and elsewhere. Yeah.
So it's very good news that you can end by telling us something's being done and there is pressure for a treaty. So just remains for me to say thank you very much indeed. It's a big topic. I think you've handled it with great ease and in English, simple, understandable English, and thank you very much indeed for that. I hope we'll have you and your colleagues back in the future to tell us that there's been some progress. Peter Burt, thanks very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Carol. It's been a pleasure.